The enforcement of Hays Code. Before outlining the enforcement of Hays Code, or rather, the Motion Picture Production Code, it should be seen as necessary to have a rough outline of its creation. In 1929, Marion Quigley, a Catholic practitioner, and Father Daniel A. Lord, a Jesuit priest, created the aforementioned Hays Code. The pair submitted the code to studios, and shortly after, in February of 1930, met with several studio heads. After deliberation and revisions, the parties agreed to the stipulations of the code. As has been widely discussed, the primary motivation of the studio's adoption of the Hays Code was to avoid governmental intervention. As to be expected by individuals widely governed by their relationship with God, the code promoted traditional values. It was divided into two parts, the first set being general principles, which prohibited a picture from, quote, lowering the moral standards of those who see it, end quote. The second set regarded particular applications, which simply was a list of items that could not be depicted. Upon the adoption of the Hays Code in 1930, two men who could be generously described as being unenthusiastic and completely ineffective were placed in charge of enforcing the code. While they were tasked with reviewing all prospective films, they were given zero authority in ordering studios to remove violations from the film, ultimately leading to attempts at reasoning with studios, which at times devolved into frantic pleas to adhere the code. As is to be expected when the realization that enforcement of the code was nigh impossible, completely disregard of the code became an open secret. In 1931, an anonymous screenwriter goes as far to say, quote, the Hays Moral Code is not even a joke anymore. It's just a memory, end quote. In June of 1934, the code was amended, which established the Production Code Administration, or PCA. This new amendment now required all films to attain a seal of approval before being released. The open mockery of Hays Code quickly subsided, and for the next 30 years, all films produced in the United States adhered to the code. This more active policing coincided with the appointment of Joseph I. Breen, again another prominent Catholic. Breen is considered to have widely influenced the production of Casablanca, objecting in totally to any direct and explicit reference to Rick and Isla having slept together while in Paris. In fact, the reach of Breen even extended to the early cartoon sex symbol, Betty Boop. Betty Boop no longer was portrayed in naughty flapper girl attire, but in an old-fashioned housewife's skirt. We can see other examples of Breen's tyranny in the 1935 sequel of actor Boris Karloff's 1931 Frankenstein. Bride of Frankenstein was no longer able to ride on the doctor's overt God complex portrayed in the original. Quote, now I know what it feels like to be God, end quote. Simply would not be allowed under the new leadership of the code. The first major instance of censorship involved the 1934 film Tarzan and His Mate, in which an entire nude scene, albeit brief, was completely and wholly edited out of the film. Another notable enforcement of the code involved Howard Hughes' 1943 western The Outlaw, which was denied a certificate from the PCA and thusly kept out of theaters for years. The reason being, the film's advertising paid a peculiar amount of attention towards Jane Russell's breast. After we can surmise to be mainly drinks shared in Bridesmaid, Hughes persuaded Breen that Russell's breast did not violate any conditions of the code, and ultimately the film could be shown.
The PCA also participated in political censorship. Perhaps the most sickening example of this is when Warner Brothers deemed it essential that they make a film about concentration camps in Nazi Germany. It should go without saying that the office forbade it, as this would run counter to the prohibited depiction of another country in, quote, an unfavorable light, quote. This also included depicting its institutions and prominent people. In fact, the PCA was so adamantly opposed to the creation of this proposed film that they threatened Warner Brothers that they would take the matter directly to the federal government if Warner Brothers decided it was to continue to pursue the film. This policy continued to prevent a fair number of anti-Nazi films from being made. However, in 1938, the FBI unearthed and were able to prosecute a Nazi spy ring, consequently allowing Warner Brothers to produce the film Confessions of a Nazi Spy. Subsequently, the Three Stooges short, You Nazi Spy, became the first Hollywood film to be able to openly lament and spoof the Third Reich. While the code was uncompromisingly enforced, films produced outside of the mainstream studios managed to skirt the system. Perhaps the most famous example being Child Bride, which is notorious in its involvement of a nude scene with a 12-year-old actress. The code began to see its power wane in the 1940s, particularly because subjects that were formerly taboo, such as rape and cross-racial marriage and cohabitation, were allowed in Johnny Belinda and Pinky. While studios scrambled to find a way to combat this new terror, directors found the answer much to the indignation of the code office and studios. They subverted the code by creativity. Alfred Hitchcock's 1946 film Notorious, for example, danced around the only 3 seconds of kissing rule by simply having his actor break their kiss every 3 seconds, while allowing this entire scene to span 2.5 minutes. The final descent into death in American history for the Hays Code can largely be viewed in its failure to censor Sidney Lumet's The Pawnbroker, as both Linda Geiser and Thelma Oliver fully exposed their breasts and subsequently a sex scene between the two. As the film was the first to receive a PCA seal of approval with the inclusion of nudity, The Pawnbroker can be attributed with dealing the fatal blow to a code that even at the time might have been described as antiquated.